For a long time, most people dismissed Steve Jobs' attacks on Microsoft as little more than a long-running Silicon Valley rivalry. Apple versus Microsoft? Jobs versus Gates. Two billionaires taking shots at each other during the PC wars. But after what happened in 2024, a lot of people started revisiting those old interviews for a different reason. Suddenly, Jobs' warnings about Microsoft no longer sounded exaggerated. When a faulty CrowdStrike update crashed millions of Microsoft Windows systems worldwide, airports stalled, hospitals faced disruptions, banks struggled with operations, and businesses across multiple countries suddenly froze at the same time. For many people, that outage exposed something bigger than a technical failure. It showed how deeply the modern world now depends on Microsoft infrastructure. That was the core of Steve Jobs' concern decades ago. Once a technology company becomes deeply embedded into everyday life, innovation stops being the only issue. Dependency becomes the issue. Today, Microsoft sits at the center of workplace software, cloud computing, cybersecurity systems, identity management, enterprise communication, AI infrastructure, and government operations across the world. This raises an uncomfortable question as to whether Steve Jobs saw this coming long before everyone else did. During the 1990s, Microsoft had already become the dominant force in personal computing. Windows controlled the PC market. Microsoft Office became the default productivity suite for businesses. Software developers prioritized Windows because that was where the users were. The industry increasingly revolved around Microsoft standards, and Steve Jobs believed that kind of dominance changed companies. In one of his most quoted criticisms, Jobs argued that the PC industry had entered the dark ages because Microsoft controlled the market without driving meaningful innovation. A lot of people interpreted that as arrogance. But there was a deeper argument underneath it. Jobs believed companies behave differently once they become the default platform everyone depends on. At first, tech companies compete by building better products. But once they dominate infrastructure, protecting the ecosystem becomes more important than reinventing it. That was the future Jobs feared. And in many ways, that is exactly the role Microsoft occupies today. Because Microsoft is no longer just software that people choose to use. For many organizations, it has become software that they cannot realistically function without. One reason Jobs' old comments feel more relevant today is that Microsoft eventually expanded far beyond the desktop market he originally criticized. The company became an enterprise infrastructure. That transformation happened gradually. Businesses standardized around Windows because employees already knew how to use it. Then, Microsoft Office became deeply integrated into workplace operations. Then, servers. Then, Active Directory. Then, Azure Cloud Services. Then, Teams. Then, enterprise security and identity systems. Over time, Microsoft stopped being a product company sitting on top of business operations. It became the operational layer underneath them. And once companies fully integrated Microsoft ecosystems into their daily workflows, leaving became increasingly difficult. That ecosystem strategy turned Microsoft into one of the most deeply embedded technology companies on Earth. Today, Microsoft infrastructure supports governments, banks, hospitals, airlines, universities, and Fortune 500 companies across the world, which means disruptions no longer affect isolated users. They affect systems. That is why the 2024 outage felt so alarming to many people. Not because outages are new, but because so much global infrastructure was tied together through the same underlying ecosystem. The modern economy increasingly runs through interconnected Microsoft layers. And that level of dependence is exactly the kind of concentration Jobs worried about decades earlier. Ironically, Steve Jobs once accepted help from Microsoft to save Apple itself. In 1997, Apple was in serious financial trouble. Then, Microsoft invested $150 million into Apple as part of a broader partnership agreement announced at Macworld. Many Apple fans hated the moment. Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen behind Jobs while people in the audience booed. But Jobs understood something important. He did not want Microsoft destroyed. He wanted competition to survive. That distinction matters, because Jobs' real concern was never that Microsoft existed. His concern was what happens when one company becomes so dominant that the rest of the industry starts organizing itself around that company's ecosystem. And regulators eventually started asking the same question. During the late 1990s antitrust case against Microsoft, the US government accused the company of abusing monopoly power tied to Windows dominance and browser distribution. At that point, Jobs' criticisms no longer sounded like personal rivalry. They sounded like an early warning about platform dependency. The biggest difference between Microsoft in the 1990s and Microsoft today is scale. Back then, Microsoft dominated personal computing. Today, Microsoft influences enormous parts of global digital infrastructure. That distinction changes everything. When Windows crashed decades ago, individual users got frustrated. When Microsoft-linked infrastructure fails today, entire sectors can feel the effects simultaneously. That's because Microsoft products are no longer isolated tools. They are interconnected operational systems. Microsoft 365 handles workplace productivity. Azure powers cloud infrastructure for major organizations. Teams became deeply integrated into communication workflows after the pandemic. Identity systems tied to Microsoft environments authenticate access across enterprise networks. Security layers connect directly to those systems. Everything increasingly feeds into everything else. And from a business perspective, Microsoft executed this strategy extremely well. The company transformed itself from a PC software giant into one of the central infrastructure providers of the modern economy. Under CEO Satya Nadella, Microsoft successfully repositioned itself around cloud computing and enterprise services after years of stagnation during the later Ballmer era. But success at that scale also creates systemic risk, because the more deeply integrated a platform becomes, the larger the consequences become when problems spread across it. That is why the CrowdStrike incident felt like more than a routine outage. For many people, it revealed how concentrated modern digital infrastructure has become. Now, Microsoft is trying to position itself at the center of another major transition, artificial intelligence. And once again, the company is embedding itself deeply into enterprise workflows. Microsoft integrated AI tools into Windows Microsoft 365 GitHub Azure cloud systems, enterprise productivity platforms. Its partnership with OpenAI gave Microsoft a major advantage in enterprise AI deployment. And this matters because AI is not just another app category. AI increasingly depends on infrastructure, cloud computing power, enterprise integration, developer ecosystems, security systems, identity systems. And Microsoft already controls large portions of those layers, which means the same concerns that existed during the Windows era are reappearing in a new form. The debate is no longer just which operating system dominates. Now, the question is, who controls the infrastructure layer powering modern AI systems? And Microsoft is positioned incredibly well to become one of those gatekeepers. That doesn't automatically mean the company is doing something wrong, but it does mean Steve Jobs' old concerns about dependency and platform concentration suddenly feel very current again. Steve Jobs was not arguing that Microsoft employees lacked intelligence, nor was he claiming Microsoft never built useful products. His deeper criticism was cultural. He believed companies lose something once preserving dominance becomes more important than building revolutionary experiences. In a famous 1995 interview, Jobs accused Microsoft of lacking taste and argued the company approached technology from an engineering-first perspective, rather than a product-first perspective. People remember the insult. But the more important part was the philosophy behind it. Jobs believed the most influential technology companies should create products that reshape how people interact with computers, not merely optimize existing systems for scale and compatibility. He thought truly transformative products came from a combination of engineering, design, intuition, and human-centered thinking working together. In his view, Microsoft increasingly prioritized standardization and market control over bold reinvention. That distinction mattered because Microsoft was becoming the default foundation for the entire PC ecosystem. Businesses depended on Windows, developers built around Microsoft standards. Corporate IT departments valued predictability and compatibility above experimentation. Over time, the company's enormous success created pressure to maintain stability across millions of systems, rather than take disruptive creative risks. And from a business standpoint, that strategy worked extremely well. Microsoft became trusted by enterprises precisely because large organizations prefer reliability, integration, long-term support, and operational consistency. Those priorities helped the company dominate corporate computing for decades. But Jobs feared something larger was happening to the industry itself. He worried that once technology ecosystems became massive enough, companies would gradually shift from inventing the future to administering existing platforms. Innovation would become incremental because too many institutions depended on those systems remaining stable. That concern feels much more relevant today than it did in the 1990s. Modern Microsoft no longer functions solely as a software developer selling standalone products. It operates sprawling cloud infrastructure, enterprise identity systems, AI deployment platforms, productivity ecosystems, cybersecurity layers, and global workplace services used by millions of organizations simultaneously. That transformation made Microsoft enormously successful. But it also made the company far more consequential than it was during the PC era. Because infrastructure companies do not simply compete inside markets anymore. They shape the technological environment that entire industries operate within. And once a company reaches that level of integration, its decisions start affecting far more than just its own customers. The reason Steve Jobs' clips keep resurfacing online isn't because people suddenly think he was right about everything. He wasn't. Microsoft adapted extremely well over the last decade. The company avoided the collapse many analysts once predicted. Its cloud business became massively profitable. Azure turned Microsoft into a major force in modern enterprise computing. And under Nadella, the company regained strategic relevance in ways few expected. But people are revisiting those interviews because the broader warning still resonates. Jobs understood that once a company becomes deeply embedded into infrastructure, society itself becomes more vulnerable to concentration. That vulnerability looks different today than it did in the 1990s. Back then, the concern was desktop dominance. Today, the concern is interconnected dependency across cloud systems, enterprise software, identity infrastructure, AI integration, and workplace operations. The technology stack underneath modern life has become highly centralized, and Microsoft sits near the center of it. That is why outages feel bigger now. That is why enterprise lock-in matters more now. And that is why Jobs' old criticisms no longer sound like ancient Silicon Valley drama. They sound like an early description of the world technology companies eventually built. In the end, Steve Jobs' warning was never simply Microsoft is bad. The real warning was about what happens when one technology ecosystem becomes so deeply integrated into society that people can no longer function comfortably without it. That is the world we now live in. Microsoft evolved from a desktop software company into critical infrastructure for governments, corporations, schools, hospitals, and global enterprise systems. And the more connected that ecosystem becomes, the harder it becomes for the world to operate independently from it. That doesn't mean Microsoft is uniquely evil. It means the scale of modern technology platforms creates risks that become visible only after dependency is already deeply established. Steve Jobs recognized that pattern decades ago. Not every detail, not every outcome, but the core dynamic itself. Because once technology companies stop competing merely through products and start competing through ecosystem dependence, their influence extends far beyond software. At that point, they stop behaving like ordinary companies. They become part of the infrastructure that modern society quietly relies on every single day.